Well, I have been studying and working this week and some last week a little bit when I could focus in Mark 13, as has been our text for quite a number of weeks. So let's open our Bibles there. We're going to mainly do some study in the book of Daniel again tonight, because we are going to come across another another reference that the Lord Jesus Christ makes in his Olivet Discourse that is important for us as Bible students, as Christians who have the Word and who study the Word, that we try to have a good understanding of what Jesus is talking about and how we are best to understand these things. I don't want to read the Olivet Discourse tonight in full, but as you're opening to Mark chapter 13, if you want to start kind of just glancing through it, Jesus makes several references to Old Testament imagery and language in the Olivet Discourse. But he makes two unique and I think rather explicit references to the prophet Daniel, to Daniel's work. And I wonder if, as we look through this tonight, just kind of skimming through our Bibles in Mark 13, if we can pick out those references. One we talked about in some detail a few weeks ago. Another one we'll talk about tonight and then on Sunday. But what are the references found relating to Daniel's work that we can find in the Olivet Discourse? So if you can find one or you know one, go ahead and raise your hand and I'll call on you. But again, Olivet Discourse is in Mark chapter 13, the entirety of it. There are several references that Jesus makes to the Old Testament scriptures. And there are two that are more explicit in their reference to the book of Daniel. One we talked about a couple weeks ago in some detail, and then another that's coming up. So I'm trying to give you some navigational points there without being too answer giving up here. I'm going to think, Lauren.
Verse 26, there's a quotation from Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
It says, "Then you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory."
Okay, that is correct. That is one of the two. That is the one that we are going to look at tonight. That is one of the two references. There's another one that we talked about a few weeks ago. Another reference to the book of Daniel, another statement that we find in Daniel's work. Stephanie. Yeah, the abomination of desolation, found in verse 14. So these are the two places that Jesus makes reference to Daniel. And if you look at, Lauren mentioned verse 26. This Sunday we'll be looking at verses 24 and following. And if you notice, verses 24 and 25 and 26 all have references, allusions to some of the prophets. We're not going to look at all of them tonight, or the point is tonight looking at Daniel, particularly in the reference to verse 26. My reason for pointing out the varied or the multiple references there to other prophets is that Jesus was speaking in the language of prophetic anticipation, prophetic imagery. He was speaking in the language that his disciples and contemporaries would have had a basis of understanding to draw upon to kind of put together an understanding of what he was talking about. It wouldn't have been maybe a fully formed picture as in hindsight we have with some things, but have definitely pointed their minds and understandings in a particular way. Now, if you remember, when we looked at the discussion, or the verse 14, speaking of about the abomination of desolation. If you think about what we did there, I guess my question is this: what did we do? What was the process that we went through in our Bible study when we're trying to come to an understanding of what that means, what that refers to, and how to understand that? What were some of the things that we did in our legwork that we went through in Bible study to figure that out? What are some things we did? Stephanie? Okay. We went to the three places in Daniel where this language is used, or at least similar language is used, and we looked at each of them in their context and tried to see whether or not that seemed to be a fit for what Jesus was talking about. So we examined the text and the context around which that language was used in Daniel chapters 9, 11, and 12. And then we came up with some various details that would have come to mind with this reference that Jesus made. For instance, Jesus was referring to, with the abomination of desolation, a thing that the Jews in his day had in the semi-recent past a precedent for, the work of Antiochus Epiphanes, when he put up an idol of Zeus or Jupiter in the temple and sacrificed a pig on the altar in Jerusalem. This was the historical kind of precedent that they have called to mind. Jesus was using that and speaking about something in the future. And in Daniel, we looked that we saw there are several different factors that would come into play with that activity. There'd be a stopping of the regular sacrifices and offerings, and it would be a practice of unique idolatry and of usually an exaltation of an individual standing where he should not be. So there's a lot of these factors that went on there, but that gave us an understanding of how to then interpret what could Jesus be talking about when it comes to the future for him. And we discussed at length what I believe is the reason why this is still a yet future thing that will happen in the run-up to the return of Christ. So let's look at Mark chapter 13, verses 24 to 27. And can I have a volunteer to read those verses for me? I am going to call on, Kara, thank you for volunteering. Mark chapter 13, 24 to 27.
But in those days after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling in heaven. The powers that are in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send forth his angels, and will gather together his elect from the farthest end of the earth to the farthest end of heaven.
Thank you, Kara. Now, the common interpretation of this, it would be the majority view inside of Christian, believing Christian circles, is that Jesus is here referring to his future return, what we would refer to as the second coming, the return of Christ. Now, my question for us tonight is, how would we begin to investigate whether this is true or not? In other words, just because this is a common or majority understanding, or the only way you've ever heard this text before, how could we investigate to see whether or not that is how we should understand this text? What are some things that we what could we do to figure that out, to try to figure that out? Daniel.
The wording kind of reminds me of Revelation.
Okay. There is reference this coming of the Son of Man in Revelation chapter 1, so there's that for sure. The sun and moon darkening is a common, I think in Ezekiel, maybe in Zechariah as well. It's though that kind of imagery is often used in some of the prophetic language. So there's that for sure. Okay. How can we investigate? Because I think probably most of us have heard or have had or have been exposed to this understanding that this is referring to the second coming of Christ. How would we or could we further investigate this, whether or not this is a legitimate interpretation, understanding of these things, particularly as it relates to verse 26, and the Son of Man coming in clouds? How could we investigate that? What could we do? Stephanie? I think we need to go, if Jesus is using the language of the prophets to speak about something that's going to yet come, it behooves us to look at the source material, the Daniel chapter 7, from which this reference comes, to try to understand how is this presented in Daniel, and does that make sense with, for instance, the way that I've walked through Mark 13, which is thinking about the future return of Christ. Is that how the book of Daniel would have presented it, and how can we understand it? So we're going to look at this to see how to understand what Jesus is talking about here when it talks about the return or the coming of the Son of Man in clouds with great power and glory. So turn to Daniel chapter 7. Now, let me read a quote here for us. And I'm going to want a couple of volunteers, probably like 5 of us, 5 volunteers, to read, 5 or 6, to read Daniel chapter 7, because we're going to read the whole chapter together, and then we're going to talk about it. So I'm going to read it. So be ready to volunteer to read after I get done reading this quote about Daniel chapter 7. It says this, one quote says this: "In the interpretation of biblical prophecy, the 7th chapter of Daniel occupies a unique place. As interpreted by conservative expositors," by that the author means those who believe the scriptures to be supernaturally inspired, that the prophetic future, speaking about the future is possible, all those basically believers, believing scholars. He says, as interpreted by conservative scholars, the vision of Daniel provides the most comprehensive and detailed prophecy of future events to be found anywhere in the Old Testament. Although its interpretation has varied widely, conservative scholars generally are agreed, with few exceptions, that Daniel here traces the course of 4 great world empires, namely Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, concluding in the climax of world history in the second coming of Jesus Christ and the inauguration of the eternal kingdom of God, represented as the 5th and final kingdom from which is from heaven. Interpreted this way, the chapter forms a major outline of future events to which additional details are given later in the book of Daniel and the New Testament, especially Revelation. Such a panorama of future events is of great importance to the student of prophecy, as it provides a broad outline to which all other prophetic events may be related. Conservative interpreters are agreed that this is genuine prophecy, that is, it is futuristic, that is related to future events from Daniel's point of view, and that its culmination is in the kingdom which Christ brings. Another commentator summarizes this way: "There yet remains for our consideration the question, what are the historical world kingdoms which are represented by Nebuchadnezzar's image in chapter 2 and Daniel's vision of the 4 beasts rising up out of the sea in chapter 7? Almost all interpreters understand that these 2 visions are to be interpreted in the same way. The 4 kingdoms or dynasties, which are symbolized in chapter 2 by the different parts of the human image, from the head to the feet are the same as those which are symbolized by the four great beasts rising up out of the sea. I read that because when we think about maybe the great prophecies of Daniel, we might think of the 70 weeks prophecy, which I would say comes to mind almost first, or maybe the prophecies found in the narrative portions of Daniel, chapter 2, or even chapter 5 with Belshazzar. But this is a significantly important and far-ranging prophecy relating to events yet future. And as I read, there is a general consensus, and you can tell me if you see it yourself. This relates to the prophecy or the vision that was given to Nebuchadnezzar of the statue of gold, or the statue of the head of gold, excuse me. So we're going to read this chapter, and it's, again, this far expansive prophecy, and we're going to look at, again, with a particular view to getting towards where the Son of Man coming in clouds. That's going to kind of be our end point. We're going to kind of look at a lot as we get there. So can I have some volunteers who'd like to read some verses here in chapter 7? Daniel, I've got 1. Okay, Marion, 2. Nathan. Pen broke. Okay. Elijah. Okay. Rachel. And Elizabeth. Okay. So, Daniel, if you can read the first 5 verses. Marion, if you could read the next 5. Nathan, the next 5. Elijah. Rachel, and then Elizabeth, you'll get, I believe you'll get the last 5 unless I counted wrong, and if so, forgive me. So, all right, so when you're ready, Daniel, please go ahead and stand up with your good reading voice. Read for us Daniel 7, 1 through 5.
First year of Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and vision in his mind as he lay on his bed. And then he wrote the dream down and related the following summary of it. Daniel said, I was looking in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and 4 beasts were coming up from the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion, and had the wings of an eagle. I kept looking until its wings were plucked, and it was lifted up on 2 feet like a man. The human mind was also given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one, resembling a bear, and it was raised up on one side, and 3 ribs were in its mouth and its teeth. And thus they said to it, Arise, devour much meat.
After this I looked, and behold, another, like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th, terrifying and dreadful and beautiful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces, and stamped what was left with its teeth. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the root. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000 thousands stood him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. And the court sat in judgment and was over.
Then I kept looking, because looking until the beast was slain, and its body was destroyed, and given to the fire. As for the rest of the beast, the dominion is taken away, but the extension of life will be granted for a time. I kept looking in the night until the cloud of heaven, one like a son of man was come. He came up to the beast, was present with him. And to him was given dominion, glory, all people, nation, and language. So, this dominion is everlasting, and to the people that serve him, which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one, which cannot be destroyed. As for me then, my spirit was distressed with vision, dream.
The visions of my mind kept alarming me. Elijah, verse 16.
I approached one of those who were standing by and began asking him the exact meaning of all this. So he told me and made known to me all the interpretation of these things. The great beasts which are pouring over are 4 kings who will rise from the earth, but the saints on the highest one will receive the kingdom and will possess the kingdom forever, for all the ages to come. Then I desired to know the exact meaning of the 4th beast, which was different from them all. The others exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth and iron and its claws of bronze, and which devoured, crushed, trampled down the remainder with its teeth. And the meaning of the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, and the 4th, which 3 of them fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth uttering great oaths, and which was larger in appearance than its associates.
As I looked, this horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High. And the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. Thus he said, As for the 4th beast, there shall be a 4th kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the kingdoms, and it shall devour the whole earth, and trample it down, and break it to pieces. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law. And they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time.
But the court will sit for judgment, and his dominion will be taken away,
Annihilated.
annihilated, and destroyed forever. Then the sovereign and dominion and greatness of all kingdoms and under the whole kingdom will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. His kingdom will be everlasting, and all the nations will serve him alone. At the point of revelation, as from the beginning, the gods were gentle living, and the face were like cats, the matter was.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, everyone, for reading. Now, I think we saw, again, a great span of history here, as I think was referenced in one of the quotes I read for us. So having read that, let's just begin to talk about this here. And what's one of the, from the first several verses, what do we know about the timing of Daniel's vision of Daniel 7? And why is this important, or how will this be helpful and important for our interpretation and understanding of this vision? What's the timing given for this vision? Stephanie?
In the first year of Belshazzar.
First year of Belshazzar, okay? Belshazzar was a king, and he was a king in which kind of empire? Anybody know? Toby? Babylon, that's right. He was a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. We know Belshazzar from the writing on the wall, the hand on the wall. That's the story he's most familiar from. It says in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. So again, we have this being significant. So when we think about the timing of Daniel's life, okay, like, where does this vision fall in relationship to all of his other experiences that we know about Daniel from his book? Any thoughts? For instance, when did the vision of the head of gold and the chest, I think, of bronze, and I forget what they were, but the great statue, when in Daniel's life did that vision get put before Daniel for interpretation? You remember? Phil? Very much at the beginning, while he was still in training in Babylon. So he'd been brought into Babylon. He was still it was in the first or second year, I believe, of Nebuchadnezzar. So he'd had a vision already, but this is before the handwriting on the wall, and this is the first of all the visions that Daniel will have in the rest of the chapters of the book. If you want to think of a division of the book of Daniel, chapters 1 through 6 are really the narrative portions. You have the stories of the fiery furnace and the story of the lion's den and those things. And Nebuchadnezzar going mad and being like a beast for a while and that kind of stuff. That all happens in the first 6 chapters. Chapter 7 to the end are the various visions of that Daniel receives and interpretations. So this is the first of the various visions that Daniel himself receives, but it's not the first one that he's had interaction with. In other words, because of Nebuchadnezzar's dream of this great statue. Let's see here. Now, so again, that's important, I think, because what we'll look at here in a minute, but later on, particularly in chapter 8 of Daniel, there is given more information that's, I think, directly related to properly even understanding what we see in chapter 7, but Daniel didn't have that information yet, but we will look at that here very shortly. So, when it comes to interpreting this great vision of the beasts and all the things, there should have been something of unique importance and significance in what we read that should have said, this should really guide my interpretation of this vision. What was that in what we read in Daniel chapter 7? It's not a trick question. Did Daniel know the meaning of his vision when he had it? He had a question. What was his question? What does it mean? And then what was the response? Well, let me tell you the interpretation. Daniel's given an interpretation of his vision, particularly as it relates to the fourth beast. Look at verse 19. I desired to know the exact meaning of the fourth beast and of those things. They kept looking. And so he asks the question. He's given, verse 23 and following gives the interpretation of what these things are. So in other words, my point is, there's stuff in the vision that is given more detail in interpretation that ought to help us guide our understanding. We ought not to miss that as we maybe get focused on one verse or one idea, that there is interpretation given. Okay? So particularly, we look at verse 17. Verse 17 says this: these great beasts, which are 4 in number, are 4 kings who will arise from the earth. How does this verse aid us in interpreting and understanding this vision of the four beasts that come out of the sea. What does that tell us? How does this aid us in maybe not just putting more flesh on these visions? What are each of these beasts? They're what? They're kings. Now, kings often stand for and are used synonymously with their kingdoms. If you're assaulting David, you're assaulting Israel. If you're assaulting Israel, you're assaulting David. If you're assaulting Nebuchadnezzar, you're assaulting Babylon, those kinds of things. So referring to kings and nations in these, with these beasts. Now, I read in the introduction that these four beasts are largely, with very much unanimity, seen as the nations of, or the various empires of Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Well, let's look at some of the details here we find in these verses to see how this, I think, matches up. Now, look at verse 4. The first is a lion with wings like an eagle. These are all regal kinds of things. But look at what it says. It says, I kept looking until the wings were plucked. Then it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and human mind also was given to it. This would call to Daniel's mind the experience with Nebuchadnezzar when he was humbled. His wings were essentially, symbolically plucked, and he was made to be like a beast for a while until he was then raised back up. Also in Daniel chapter 2, the head of gold is Nebuchadnezzar, is the king, is the kingdom of Babylon. That was, Daniel said that directly to Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2. I don't think this one was very confusing to him. Second beast, another, was like a bear, was raised up on one side and 3 ribs were in its mouth, and its teeth was said to arise and devour much meat. This is typically, properly I think, seen as the Medo-Persian Empire. Now I'll say that, first of all, because historically speaking, it was a lopsided duality of the empire. The Persians were the dominant force in that group. The Medes were the minor party in that force. But also, if you look at chapter 8, which is a vision that comes 2 years later to Daniel, Daniel was told given this vision of a ram and a goat. This great ram that came and nothing could stop it until this very fast, kind of quick, powerful goat came and dethroned him. Well, this ram, or the ram, as we see in Daniel 8 verse 20, represents the kings of Media and Persia. And verse 21, the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece. So we have already these next two, or at least 2 kingdoms that will be in succession later on in Daniel's life. What we see very closely are the kings of the Medes and Persians and then of Greece. And if we see this very powerful beast, this bear, matches that. And then this leopard, this third beast, this leopard, which again, leopard with 4 wings of a bird. It has this very image of speed. And so I think it's proper to see these as the Medes and Persians, and then of Greece. And this 4th most ferocious animal, or the beast, is seen as one that supplanted Greece, which was Rome, which was very different than the other beasts. It didn't just conquer, it destroyed and just made, the difference in the way in which the Persians or the Greeks conquered and then ruled was very different than Rome. Rome crushed and sold into slavery and just destroyed nations. The Medes and the Persians and the Greeks, they just tried to take over and govern that which was there. Largely, they were very, very different. So we have, again, these very different empires here. But verses 9 through 12 of Daniel chapter 7 relates to the ending of this 4th empire. Again, this worst, this most terrifying beast. Now, in verse 11, what are some of the ways in which the severity and finality of the judgment upon this empire is described? Verse 11 in Daniel 7 speaks about the ending of this fourth empire. What are some of the ways in which, found in verse 11, that the finality or the severity of this empire is described in that verse? 70.
It was killed and his body was destroyed and given to the burning fire.
It was, yeah, it was utterly destroyed. It was burned with fire. And verse 12 kind of gives a kind of almost an epitaph. The other beast says, their dominion was taken away, but an extension of life was granted to them for an appointed period of time. And I think the idea there is that when Babylon was conquered, there was still some Babylonian kind of influence that prolonged even when they weren't the dominant power. The same with the Medes and Persians, same with even Greece. Those kind of influences kind of, we call it the Greco-Roman world, that those kind of continued into the rest of that nation. But when this final beast is destroyed, it will be final, it will be destroyed, it will be given to the burning fire. So we have, I think, this different description of the ending of this fourth beast, which I think is Rome, or the Roman Empire. And now we're going to talk about, again, this is all getting to speaking about the context and the flow of the narrative when it comes to these characters known as the Ancient of Days and the one like the Son of Man. So my question for us is, what are the identities of the Ancient of Days and the one like the Son of Man? And you can't say, well, it's God because they're capitalized. I mean, you can say that, but that's not exactly the level of investigation I'm looking for here. You wouldn't be wrong in that answer, but I want us to go deeper. What do you think of the identities of the Ancient of Days and the one like the Son of Man that we see in verses 9 through 14? Why would we come to maybe the conclusion that we're talking about God here? Let's look at the Ancient of Days. What about this would give us, I think, the picture that we're not talking about a mere human ruler? Any thoughts? Ancient of Days, it's a pretty unique title. His vesture was white like snow, hair like pure wool. His throne was ablaze with flames. I mean, we have some very powerful imagery here of the unique power and authority. Its wheels were a burning fire. Again, this maybe calls to mind Ezekiel's vision of the wheel in the wheel, kind of thing like that. And from this river of fire flowing from before him, again, we have this amazingly majestic, powerful picture that it would make a lot of sense if we're talking about God himself as the Ancient of Days. So I think it's proper to see the capitalized Ancient of Days there, at least in my translation of verse 9. Now, when it comes to the Son of Man, how do we understand the Son of Man? You might say, and I think appropriately so, well, Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, so wouldn't this make sense? I think looking back, yeah, that does make a lot of sense. Ezekiel also was called a Son of Man at different times, so you have to be careful about that. We see here that this Son of Man came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and it was to this one was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, and that all peoples, nations, of men of every language might serve him. And this kingdom would be forever, have no end, and would never be destroyed. So we have, again, this picture of everlasting rule, not a temporal rule. Some Christians would say, well, the best interpretation of the Son of Man is he's standing in reference to all of the saints of the Most High, the saints of the highest one, because they're the ones who are given the kingdom later on in the section. Now, I don't think it's wrong to see that the saints are the ones who are in the kingdom, but I believe it would be wrong to say that the Son of Man stands for like believers, because look what happens in verse 14. It says, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve this one who is the Son of Man. Whenever that language is used, serving, it's in the context of serving God or serving a God. I don't know about you, but there's no way in which a believer ought to say, it makes sense that nations ought to serve me or ought to serve other believers. This is proper to see this as Jesus here. Or again, hindsight, Jesus, foresight, looking forward, this promised one of God, this divine individual. So I think we have this regal, divine scene here. But what's important, I think, as we move forward to its connection to Mark chapter 13, what is the historical timing of this of when the Son of Man comes to the Ancient of Days? What is the timing of that? What's the context, the time context around when that happens? What happened? Yeah, Stephanie. Okay, we have judgment being rendered, okay, which could mean the final judgment day of the Lord. It could mean that can be used of general judgment, but okay, so that's pointing us to at least there's a time of judgment going on. What else? We talked to Daniel. Comes after the utter destruction of the fourth beast. Not a destruction that was kind of where there was a continuing influence of, but an utter destruction of this fourth beast. And I think that is very significant. This presentation of the Son of Man to the Ancient of Days occurs when this final beast, this final world empire is utterly vanquished. So, when it comes now, and then right after that, there's this installation of a kingdom that will have no end. Of the king, and a kingdom he's given, again, to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom. The Son of Man is given these things, and the language is in the context of empires and ruling of nations. This one, like the Son of Man, is given this similar thing, but is dissimilar in that it lasts forever. So, how is this information we've looked at here helpful and important as it comes to the question of interpreting Mark chapter 13 when it comes to, then I saw, and they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds of power and glory. I guess the question is, would the hearers of Jesus be rightly thinking about something of an end, climactic, culminating, final activity, or something that was in the middle of a history that kind of goes on and on and on as it has forever? What would have been the thinking, the imagery that knowledgeable Bible students, would have had as they hear Jesus speaking about these things? Would have been pointing towards the end of time or something in the middle of normal history? I think the answer is the end of time. Now, you can use imagery and phrases in ways differently. You can do that. But I think that the important thing here is that by itself, this presentation of the Son of Man is pointing to the final activity of normal human history prior to, we would talk about, I would use the language of the millennial kingdom of Christ. Some will say this refers to this coming in clouds is reference to the destruction of the temple, because that was a judgment upon the nation, those kinds of things, an enthronement of somehow this enthronement of Christ. And I think there are arguments for that, but I think that we have a problem with the context of Daniel's use of that language. When Daniel uses it, it's when this final beast is utterly and finally destroyed. Not when that final beast is the one destroying the Jewish state. So all that to say is, the question is, that I opened with, is it right to see verses 24 to 27 as the return of Christ, the second coming of Christ, as maybe we've always, the common or the majority opinion? And my answer is, I think absolutely so. But not just because that's maybe what you've always heard, or what maybe fits in maybe your own thoughts or minds, but I think it fits with the flow of history from Daniel chapter 7. And I believe it fits in with the flow of Jesus' own words in Mark chapter 13. So sometimes doing those investigative excursions shows exactly what you had thought beforehand, but now I hope you have a better grasp and a deep understanding of just why this language makes a lot of sense when it comes to the final end of days, the final end of normal human history, I should say, prior to the millennial kingdom, and not just an activity in the midst of the history that's already taken place. Well, I'm over time. I'll close with a prayer, and we can, if you have any questions or comments, I'd love to talk with you more about them. Let me close with prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for tonight, that we can be together. Lord, I pray that you bless this study, that it was beneficial, and that it was both educational and encouraging to your people. Thank you in Christ's name. Amen.